All right, we're ready to start the book of Nehemiah tonight. Micah has been teaching the book of Ezra. This trimester we're looking at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They all fit into this post-exile period. And he did an excellent job covering the book of Ezra. And we wanted him to, since he was leaving in the middle of this trimester, to just take my slot until he leaves. And so since we're switching gears here, we're switching teachers starting tonight. So be that as it may, we're ready to look at the book of Nehemiah, chapters 1 and 2, and always we want to look at some introductory things about Nehemiah. So let's talk a little about who the author is of this book and some background information. That's always helpful. And then we'll look at chapters 1 and 2, pretty simple chapters. And we'll look for some very practical things to learn. The author is most obviously Nehemiah. However, Jewish tradition says it was Ezra. And the reason for that is that the early manuscripts of these books put Ezra and Nehemiah together as one book. And that doesn't suggest that they were originally one, but that was the case in the early manuscripts. The Septuagint translation joins them together. The Hebrew Bible began dividing them in 1448, according to Edward J. Young. So there's a little bit of trivia there concerning the division of the book. It must be Nehemiah because he speaks of himself in first person. Chapter 1 tonight in our study, verse 11, he said, "I was the king's cupbearer." So he writes in first person, he must be the author of the book. And he makes other references like that throughout. So there's really no doubt in my mind that it is Nehemiah. The principal character of the book is obviously this man Nehemiah. That's why the book is called Nehemiah. He was the leader of the third group. Now we'll say more about that third group and the dates and go back over that, and I hope you're writing these down as Micah gave them earlier. But here's a little bit about what we know about Nehemiah. We know who his father was, verse 1 of chapter 1, Hakaliah. He was a cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. We'll say more about what that would have involved when we get to that in chapter 1 and verse 11. That would have been a position of honor and great responsibility. The first 7 chapters obviously reveal the fact that he was a great leader, and we're going to focus on the leadership in the book. And he was a civil governor appointed by the Persian king, according to chapter 5 and 14. So he was more than just a leader among God's people. He had been appointed since he was in the confidence of the king as kind of a satellite leader for Artaxerxes. And we'll say who that is and just say more about who that is in a moment. And he was a man who feared God and wanted to fear God, according to chapter 1 and 5 and 1 and 11. And so he was a great man. Now we know a little bit, we think, about who his brother was. We'll say more about that in a moment, though there is some question of whether this man was his brother. We see him mentioned in chapter 1 and chapter 7. Now what about the date of the book? The span of Nehemiah's work, the third group returned about 445. And if you have following someone else's chronology and they say 444, we won't argue over that. Some shift that one way or another. But we're going to go with 445 for our dating purposes here. And that was about 12 years after the close of Ezra. So when Micah got through teaching Ezra last week, just imagine now 12 years have passed, and now we're ready to jump into this time period with Nehemiah. Nehemiah left and returned about 12 or 13 years later, according to chapter 13. We'll give you the details of that a little bit later. Jensen suggests he didn't return to 420. Now, if you're familiar with Irvin Jensen's work, it's always brief and he doesn't give a lot of explanation. How he arrived at that, I'm not sure, but it's always interesting to look at some of Jensen's details like his dates. Well, that brings us, ignoring the 420 now, I'm just suggesting that's a possibility. That brings us to about 432 BC, allowing for the events of chapter 13, would put the end of Nehemiah about 430, or if Jensen's correct, about 420. It'd be 10 years later. So when was the book written? Well, it couldn't have been written before 432. And so then some would assume about 430. Jensen would say it wouldn't be written before 420. So it was around 430 or later that the book was written. Now you stop and think about that. When did the first group return? 536. Here are the dates. And if you don't have these written down, you might write these in the margin at the book of Nehemiah to remind us. When they went away in groups. The first group went in 606. The second group went in 597, and the third group went in 586. 70 years from the 606 brings us to 536. That was the first group that returned, with Joshua and Zerubbabel being the leaders. And so we've been talking about that in the book of Ezra. Well, in 458 BC is when the second group returned under the leadership of Ezra. We saw that at the end of the book of Ezra that we just finished. Well, now we're ready for the third group, 445, or if some will say 444. We're not going to argue over that. I don't know that I can. But 445 BC, we have the third group to return, and Nehemiah is the leader under the third group. And so they went away in groups, they come back in groups. Make sense? So this is where we are at 445 BC. And so he's covering these years to about 430. But my point about how long that's been, the first group came back about 536. If Nehemiah's work ends about 430, how long has that been? Huh? No, from 536, since the first group returned to the end of the book of Nehemiah, yeah, well over 100 years is my point. Been a long time. So what I'm wanting us to get is the picture that we may, in studying this, think, well, the first group returned, and then 2 or 3 years later, and the next group returned, and then just a little bit later, the next group returned. This all happened within 15 years. No, that didn't happen in that short period of time. We're going from 536 to the time we get through with the book of Nehemiah, we're at about 430. Make sense? Remember, BC dates go backwards. So that 430 is later than, so it's a little over 100 years. Make sense? All right. So those are the groups that we want to talk about. Now let's talk about the Persian kings before we go a little bit further. It helps to know how this kind of plays out because we're under the Persian Empire. Remember, they went into Babylonian captivity, but the reason they were released from Babylonian captivity is because the Persians have taken over. Remember? And remember Cyrus gave the creed? Well, that was Cyrus the Great. And I'm not going to go through the dates of each one of these, but I want to show you just a little bit about some of the Persian leaders. This is taken from Baxter, J. Sidlow Baxter. You hear me quote from him frequently. And then you have Cambyses, and then come on down, and we've been talking about Darius. There's two Darius. Darius the first, Darius the second. We're right down here talking about Artaxerxes is who we're talking about in this study. He's mentioned in Ezra 7 and Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1. So that's the Persian king we're talking about, Artaxerxes, when he talks about the king that he goes before and the king that sends him and gives him permission to go. All right. So what is the message of the book of Nehemiah? Rebuilding the wall. Now remember, under Joshua and Zerubbabel, they started building the temple, rebuilding the temple, and then it stopped, and then later they finally finished that. But before the second group comes in, then Ezra comes in, and the work is focusing on restoration. But now when Nehemiah comes, his focus is rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem. That's the focal point. Make sense? That's not all he does, but that's the focal point. So that's the message of the book. So chapter 1, I like Jensen's little summary of chapters 1 through 6. He said chapter 1 is the prayer, chapter 2 is the preparation, and chapters 3 through 6 is the performance. And so you have the prayer about the matter, you have the preparation over the matter, and then you have the performance of the matter. And that ought to be the case of anything we do. We ought to pray about it, we ought to prepare it, and then we ought to perform it. Good practical observation from Irvin Jensen. All right, here's an outline from Baxter. I borrow his outline. I like his way of organizing the book of Nehemiah. Two major points. There's the reconstruction of the wall, chapters 1 through 6. And then there's going to be the reinstructing of the people. The reinstructing of the people in chapters 7 through 13. Now, you're going to see this time and again as we work our way through the book of Nehemiah. So right now we're focusing on rebuilding the wall, reconstruction of the wall. Now here's some things I want you to watch for, and we'll hopefully have a time at the end. We're going to summarize particularly point number 2. But I want you to watch for these lessons in the book of Nehemiah. One is to focus on the fear of God. It's not mentioned a lot. But what I want you to notice is the fear of God's mentioned in chapter 1 and verse 11. These people desire to fear your name. So even though the term fear is not mentioned a lot in the book, it's going to be mentioned later in chapter 5. Even though it's not mentioned a lot in the book, what can I conclude from those who desire to fear your name? These people desire to fear your name. All right, there is a remnant. But if these people are said to fear God, what you started to say something? All right, they learned their lesson in captivity. That's good. That even though fear is not mentioned in the rest of the book, if these people are labeled as people who fear God, that when they're doing things right, that must be something the fear of God causes them to do. Would you agree? Or it's at least in harmony with the fear of God. For example, when Jeremiah later I won't call him Jeremiah. Nehemiah praises God as the great and awesome God. That's part of the fear of God, isn't it? So watch for things the fear of God will cause you to do. Secondly, we're going to try to take some time on this one in a moment. Leadership. Nehemiah was a leader. Anybody that wants to be a leader, you need to read the book of Nehemiah. You need to focus on leadership in Nehemiah. If you ever want to be a leader in your home, in the church, however you want to be a leader, there's principles of leadership. Chapter 4, we're going to focus on a mind to work. Chapter 3, everybody doing their part. And then how the enemies work in chapter 4. We learn a lot about enemies in chapter 4. Make sense? Watch for that in the book as we go along. All right, we're ready for chapter 1. Let's go to question number 1 for tonight, a summary of chapter 1. What's chapter 1 all about? Very good, very good. All right, that's chapter 1. Here's an outline of chapter 1. I call it Nehemiah is informed of the distress and he prays. So we have 3 themes here. The report given to Nehemiah concerning Jerusalem, 1-4, and then Nehemiah's prayer, the elements of the prayer, and then we have Nehemiah as the king's cupbearer. That's an important point. That's not just an insignificant, oh, by the way. The oh, by the way makes an important point about the storyline, and we'll come to that in a moment. Let's talk about 1-4. Where is the setting for this? The words of Nehemiah, who we know who he is. It came to pass. When did it take place? All right, in the month of Chislev. That corresponds with December. And the 20th year of, in the 20th year, that's the 20th year of Artaxerxes, that would be 445. So December, for us, of course, they didn't go by December, but corresponding with the time of the year, about December, early part of December for us. In 445 is when this takes place. Where does this setting take place? In Susa. Some translation will say Shushan. If I can find my mouse here, we're going to... Here we go. Here we go right here is what I'm looking for. This is Babylon. If you could picture off of the map over here, the Fertile Crescent. Starting over here would be Jerusalem. You go across the Fertile Crescent and then come down to the city of Babylon. Then on over there you see Susa, Shushan. Same place. Same, just goes by different names. That's where the palace of the Persian Empire is. Daniel, we'll see later, had a vision there. And so he's in the palace. Now, what's he doing in the palace of the king? Well, he's the king's cupbearer. Very important job. And had the confidence of the king. All right? So that's the setting for that. Now, let's start at verse 2. Who came to Nehemiah? I'm sorry? Men from Judah. And it says Hanani. Chapter 7, verse 2 identifies him. Nehemiah says he was my brother. Now there's a question. Is he brother in the sense that he's part of the brethren? Many think, and I want to lean toward that this was Nehemiah's fleshly brother. his brother in the flesh. We'll say more about that in chapter 7. So I'm not going to argue that right now. But I'm assuming that he is his brother, but you say, well, he was just part of the Jewish brethren. Okay, fine. Whoever this was, Hanani, and some other brethren come, and what do they tell him? Yes. We've been there all this time. Now think about this now. You do the math. I'm not good with doing that on the fly, but they came back in 536. And we've already said that's been in excess of 100 years since they've been there. And so from 536 to 445, I think, is 91 years. Am I right about that? Is that? I believe I'm 91 years. Anyway, somewhere right is that. Micah says we're right. He's younger than I am, so we'll go with that. So 91 years since they've been there, and the walls are still laying flat, and the gates are burned. Nothing has been done there. Now, the temple's been rebuilt. There's been some progress, but the walls are still laying flat. Now, what verse 4 was his reaction? He sat down and wept. For how long? Many days, the text says. Many has been supplied by, in some translations. He sat down for days, many days, and he mourns and he weeps. You learn anything? I mean, if we stopped right there, is there any practical thing we take away from that? Somebody, who's that over here? Mark? He's emotional? All right. He was expecting more progress. What'd you say? He's extremely sorrowful. I see a man who has great concern about things that pertain to God. In other words, he hears that things concerning God and God's people is not what it should be, and it caused him great sorrow. That's a characteristic of a good leader. Something practical already we've seen. Now let's begin at verse 5 through 11. Nehemiah, the second thing he does is spend time in prayer. Let's focus on the elements of his prayer. Question number 4, you tell me. What points were found in Nehemiah's prayer?
Starts out with praise God.
All right, there's praise. What else is there?
Fasting and prayer.
All right, there was fasting going on. Starts with praise. What else does he do?
Supplication as far as asking God to get attentive to his prayer.
Yes. Makes a request God to hear the prayer, to remember his promise. And that's what I was fishing for. Say that again. He confesses the sin of the people and his own sin, doesn't he? And he asks something else at verse, what verse is that?
He goes into depth with that sin, showing as far as being something that's been the fathers have done, and it's been a continual issue, and that you haven't kept the commandments and rules. So he's more specific than just saying, I've sinned.
Yes, yes. Very good. So let's go through these elements of prayer. He starts with praise. Before he does anything, before he starts acting, before he starts getting a group together, he mourns, and then having mourned, he turns to God in prayer. And notice the words you might underline, because this is tied with the fear of God that we're going to talk about. He calls him the great and awesome God. So he starts off with praise. You keep your covenant and mercy, and you observe on those who love you and observe your commandments. And then please give ear and listen to us. Now, beginning at verse 6 and 7, there's the focus on Judah's sin. And that as we pray before you, that Israel has sinned against you, both my father's house and I have sinned. There's another mark of a good leader who recognizes his own weakness. And he's not just focusing on everybody else, but he focuses on himself too. But anyway, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Verse 7, we have acted corruptly and have not kept your commandments that you commanded through your servant Moses. Now, I paraphrase that. That wasn't a word for word of verse 7. But in other words, the point is we have sinned. That's what brought us here in the first place. And then after we got here, Ezra has just been dealing just a few years earlier, about 12, 15 years earlier, he was dealing with corruption. So we've sinned. Then he says, there's a plea to remember God's promises. Now, verse 8, that you said, and I'm going to paraphrase verse 8, you told us, God, that if we were unfaithful, you would scatter us. That's Leviticus 26:33 is where that's found. That's what you said, and you did. All right, verse 9, but you also said, God, that if we return to you, no matter how far we'd been scattered, verse 9, that I will gather them and bring them to the places chosen as my dwelling place. A reference to the dwelling place would be Deuteronomy 12, but the quotation he's talking about would be Leviticus 26:40-46 and Deuteronomy 31-10. I'll give those verses again, those Leviticus numbers in just a second. At verse 8, it's Leviticus 26:33, and then verse 9, it's Leviticus 26:40-46 and Deuteronomy 31-10. So God, remember your promise. You remembered and scattered us all right, but please remember us and bring us back. So the plea is to remember your promise. But now then, let's get to verse 11. I pray, give attentive ear. Now notice back, let's go before we get through with verse 11. Here's another praise. He mentions that you redeemed us how? Two things. By your great power and your strong hand. Praising God for his strength and his power. Now, verse 11, be attentive to our ear and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. We'll come back to that phrase. Let your servant prosper and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Who is this man? The king, Artaxerxes. And so he's praying that God would help him in his relationship and he's dealing with Artaxerxes, that Artaxerxes would help him in the mission that needs to take place. And then he adds, for I was the king's cupbearer. And so that's a footnote as to how he had access. Perhaps that was by providence that he had worked to that. I don't know. The text doesn't tell me that. I'm just saying perhaps. I'm using the language of Philemon and 15. Philemon 15. That's the language I'm using. That perhaps that's the case. Anyway, the point is, by being the king's cupbearer, he goes in before the king. Now, the king's cupbearer was highly trusted because he was the one that tasted the wine to see if it was poisonous before taking it and giving it to the king. So when he gives the wine to the king fully trusts him. Some suggest, though we don't know for sure, that he may have been a eunuch because he was before the king with the presence of the queen, and that often was not allowed unless the man coming in was a eunuch. So he very well may have been. Who knows? But be that as it may, he was the king's cupbearer, and that's the footnote to say this is what gave him access to the king. Again, that may be by providence. So Nehemiah is informed, and he prays about the matter, and now we're ready to go to chapter 2. Question, before we do that, I want to go back to verse 11. You might underline, desire to fear your name. Help me out, Mark. I'm coming back to you in a minute. I want the ESV on that. I'll come back to you in a moment. What do you learn from that? They desire to fear your name. They delight in it? Is that what the ESV says, Mark? Yes. Okay, that's what I couldn't remember. They delight to fear in your name. The New American says the same thing. The several other translations, Legacy, I believe it may do that, I'm not sure. But be that as it may, they desire to fear your name. In other words, it's a picture that these people fear God, but not only do they fear God, they want to fear God. Or as the ESV said, they delight in that. Nehemiah is a key person here. We've seen that he praises God highly, great and awesome God with a strong right hand, etc. We're going to see other things with reference to fear. They desire to fear your name. Yes, ma'am.
What you're talking about, desire to fear your name, goes back up to the quotes that he's given for God. You've given these promises, and if they will come back and make your name good, then this is the promises that he's telling them, and these are people that you've sent back. They're ready for what you're giving them now. Let's give it.
Good point. Good point. Question 2. Summary of chapter 2. What's it about? Say again. Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. Yes. Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. Here's what happens now. We're going to see he makes the request to go to Jerusalem, and it's granted by the king. He returns, and that's upset the enemies. We're going to see more about those enemies in chapters 4 and 5, and particularly chapter 4. And then Nehemiah assesses the situation and rallies of the people. So this is just preparation. And so Jensen is right. Prayer, chapter 1, preparation, chapter 2. I like that. This is preparation work. So let's see about Nehemiah. Let's get a date here. He came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So this is 4 months later, which would bring us over into 444. So 4 months later now. So four months have passed since he got the news till this is going on. Why is that significant? I'm not completely sure, except some time to prepare and get things going. And he said he took the wine in, and he'd never been sad in the presence of the king, the text says. So when the king asked him, what was his reaction? He first was afraid to reveal this before the king. But the king made an observation that you're not sick, verse 2. Here's a practical thing I'm learning from that. Sometimes there is concern and care and sadness you can't hide. Some people can hide sadness. They can hide their concern. They can hide their care. But sometimes it gets so deep you can't hide that anymore. Nehemiah couldn't. He couldn't do that at all. And so his response, he said to the king, "O king, live forever, watch into my face, not be sad, because," what did he say? "I'm sad because." Yeah, he told him the situation he'd learned about. So the king then asked, what? Yeah, what do you need from me? What are you asking for? And the first thing he does, verse 4, this is interesting. Before he answers the king, I prayed to the God of heaven. What he said, we're not told. So he said, I prayed to the God of heaven. Then he said to the king, if I found favor, so what was his request? Let's get 5, 6, 7, and 8 and summarize that. Here's what I need. I want you to send me to Judah. I want to rebuild the wall. And the king wanted to know how long it's going to take. And okay, here's how long I'll be gone. They set the time, and okay, they agreed to that. Then what did he do? Verse 7. All right, basically a passport says he's able to pass through, right? And I'm on a mission from the king. In other words, this is not just I'm going on a vacation, but he's on a mission for the king. And send a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. What's that going to say? Give me lumber, give me supplies for the building of the gates and for the building of my house. And he said, the king granted that. Now you might underline at the end of verse 8, according to the good hand of my God upon me. Where have we seen that before? In Ezra. Micah's talked about that several times. I think it's a statement of providence. The hand of my God was upon me. And according to the good hand of God, that was granted to me. And so the king gave me all that permission, and here I go. I'm ready. The king's ready for me to roll. All right, now let's look at verses 9 and 10. At verse 9 and 10, what's the point?
Brings up basically the villains in our story, Sanballat and
Tobiah.
And that they're displeased when he shows up because they've been kind of running things.
Yeah, they didn't like this, but this is interesting because he has the authority of the king. He's not just on a mission where they can then attack him and do something, because to attack Nehemiah is to attack an agent of the king. They don't want to mess with the king.
Nehemiah wasn't by himself. He also had officers in the army.
Yes, he did.
It looks like he showed up unannounced. They didn't know he was coming, and all of a sudden this big guy from
Absolutely. Get ahead of ourselves. Chapter 4, at verse 1, you'll see Sanballat is mentioned. He was to the north of Jerusalem. All right, verse 3 mentions Tobiah. He was to the south. Now you get the picture. Palestine's not very wide. The opposition is to the north and to the south, kind of sandwiched in between enemies. So you got Sanballat and Tobiah. We're not done with them when we leave chapter 2. We're just getting started with them. They're going to cause us some problems in chapter 4. But they didn't like this. And so that's the point of verse 10. When they found out, they were deeply disturbed that a man would come seeking the well-being of the children of Israel. Can't do much about it, but we're going to see what they try to do in a moment at verse 18. Or rather, verse 19, excuse me. So now then, let's move on to chapter 2 and verse 11. Nehemiah goes to assess all of this. So let's see what he does. Now, at verse, he said, so I came to Jerusalem and it was there how long? He was there for 3 days. All right, give me a second. Let me find a map here. And this is what I want right here. We're going to zoom in on this. All right. This is the city of Jerusalem as per the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. And whatever color this is, those of you visiting don't know this, but I can't tell what that is. So whatever this shade of color is around here, that's the wall supposedly that Nehemiah built. Now, let's follow kind of where he went and what he saw here just a little bit. Beginning at verse 11. He spent 3 days there before he went out. What do you deduce? Let's get ahead of ourselves at verse 16. Said the officials didn't know what was going on. What do you deduce from that when Nehemiah come rolling into Jerusalem that he didn't do? He didn't, good point. He didn't come in with a lot of fanfare saying, hey fellas, I got this entourage with me and I want everybody to take notice and I've got a letter of approval from the king and got my authorization right here and I'm here to get things rolling. He didn't do that. He just kind of slips in to Jerusalem. And then he's going to survey the damage. So let's start at verse 11. He went out by night and a few men went with him and they didn't even have an animal except the one that he rode. And he said, I told no one, now this is an interesting phrase, what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. In other words, he felt that God had put in his heart what he's to be doing at Jerusalem. And he said, I hadn't told anybody about that. So I went out by night through the valley gate. Now here's the valley gate right here. These little dash marks looks like a little equal sign. That's the valley gate. And so apparently he comes out at the valley gate and makes his way down so far and then comes back and makes his way back into the city. And doesn't really get a complete picture of the whole city at the moment, it seems to me. Let's go at verse 13. I went through the valley gate and then down to the refuge gate, which is to the south of that. You'll notice that on the map. And saw the walls broken down, burned with fire. Then he came to the fountain gate. And you see the king's pool that's mentioned at verse 14. That's right down at the bottom of the curve, down at the bottom. So you have the fountain gate, the dung gate. That's the refuge port. And the valley gate. So he comes out and makes his way from the center of that circle, makes his way around. And right there where that hand is, the king's pool. And why didn't he go much further? No room to pass, the text says. So I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so I returned. Didn't tell the officials, he said, what was going on, nor the nobles. And then I said to them, what does he say? Verse 17, you might underline. You see? Yeah, it's a bad situation. You see the distress that we're in. And then he makes a plea saying what? Let us rise up and build. So he surveyed the situation. Now we're starting at verse 17 down here at the end. He's stirring the people. This is a quality of a good leader. He assesses the situation first before he comes up with a plan. Sometimes leaders try to come up with a plan and they don't know what they're dealing with first. That's a quality of a good leader. We'll say more about that here. I'm trying to save some time to do that here in just a second. So verse 17, he said, come let us rise and build the wall of Jerusalem that we're no longer be a reproach. And I told them, the hand of my God, which is good upon me. There's that phrase again. The hand of God being upon me. And he said, and also the king's words. And so the people responded, what'd they say? Might underline that. Highlight that if you have an electronic Bible. Highlight that. Put it in that yellow box, whatever you've got the capability of doing. Let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to do this work. But we're not through with Sanballat and Tobiah. What'd they do? Yeah. The New King James says they laughed us to scorn. What'd they say?
Accused them of being rebels.
You're rebels. In fact, they're not through with the ridicule. Chapter 4, they're going to say, if a fox ran up and knock your wall down, what a pitiful job you're doing. They're going to make fun of, and you'll be made fun of too, in the work you're doing.
This is more than likely, this is dangerous to accuse someone of rebelling against the king.
Oh, yes. They laughed us to scorn and asked, what are you doing? Will you rebel against the king? Well, he had the king's authority with him. In other words, he had the king's passport right there in his hand. And don't know that they fully understood that, be that as it may. So I answered them, and what was his response? Verse 20.
Well, they're using the king, and he goes to God and says, God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will rise and build. But you have no right.
But that's fascinating to me. And let me start painting a picture. Before they entered the land of Canaan, God told them, when you get there, and you're going to see the Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Herbicites, etc., all these people. What do you do with them? Drive them out, have nothing to do with them. When they got there, what'd they do? They didn't drive them out completely, and so they mixed and mingled with them. Caused problems, Psalm 106. When they finally went off in captivity to come back, what do? They're supposed to stay separated. Yeah, they intermarried. We just talked about that, chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra. All right? Here is a statement of emphatic separation. That, notice the wording of this. You have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. You ain't got nothing to do with us. Stay out of our way. Stay back. We're not going to compromise with you. Well, they try to get him to come to the plains of Ono. We'll talk about that a little bit later and see what happens. All right. Any questions or comments quickly before we start talking about, in the last 5 minutes, some practical things and leadership? I want to focus on leadership for a moment.
One of the things he says to the people is the word we. He uses that word and joins them, joins him with his cause, because they're brethren, and because he's the leader. He's not saying, you leaders rise up and build. He's not saying,
Let us do that. That's a good point. Very good point. All right, find you a blank spot somewhere on the back of your questions or somewhere. Let's start listing, and we're not going to be done tonight. We're going to finish this list later. Let's make a list of qualities of leadership that we've already seen in 2 chapters. So we've got about 5 minutes, and it's probably what it's going to take. So let's get going here. This is Nehemiah being a great leader. Number 1, he kept abreast of the situation. Chapter 1, verse 2. Someone informed him what's going on. You can't lead if you don't know the circumstance. Number 1, he kept abreast of the circumstance or the situation. Number 2, chapter 1, verse 2, same verse. He sought information. Good leaders seek information. In other words, you don't make assumptions. He didn't say, well, I know what's going on. I'm going to send somebody over to rebuild. He went and looked himself. But he's asking for information from Hanani, his brother. Number 3, he cared. Chapter 1, verse 4, chapter 2, verse 3, chapter 13, verse 8. I know he cared because he cried. Number 4, he prayed. Good leaders pray. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. We see it again. We'll see it again in chapter 6 and chapter 13, but we'll get to that later. Number 5, he was humble. Chapter 1, verse 6. Remember what he said in chapter 1, verse 6? Both my fathers and I have sinned. He didn't talk about the rebels he's leading. He talked about we have sinned. He was humble. Number 6, he saw his own weakness. Same verse, chapter 1, verse 6. He saw his own weakness. Man can't lead, a woman can't lead and any form of leadership that don't see their own weakness. Number 7, he didn't wait on others, but he had this I can attitude. Notice what he said in chapter 2 and in verse 5. And he said, if it pleases the king and your servant them have found favor in your sight, send me to Judah. He didn't wait. Well, somebody needs to get over and build. How many times have you seen a circumstance where you could do something and you sit back? I'm talking about myself too. Somebody needs to do something about that. Somebody needs to act. Somebody needs to say something. Nehemiah heard about this and he said, somebody needs to go and I'm going to go. All right? Well, I've lost my place. What number are we ready for? 8. Number 8. He looked and planned ahead. Took him 4 months before he talked to the king about it. Chapter 2. And then chapter 2 and in verse 8, that he planned ahead in the sense I need letters to get through these areas, and I need letter to Asaph to get the permission for the lumber. So he planned ahead. Some leaders get right in the middle of something they hadn't planned. What are we going to do now? I don't know. We hadn't thought that far. Number 9, he was led by God. Chapter 2, verse 12. Number 10, he got a good assessment before proceeding. Chapter 2, verse 12 through 20. Sometimes, from the vantage point of an elder, you hear about a problem. You don't go and jump and try to solve the problem until you find out if there was really a problem in the first place. It might not have been the problem you were told about. So you don't go condemn somebody till you get an assessment of what the real circumstance is. He got an assessment of the circumstance before he was ready to act. He didn't rally the people and say, let's go build, and then get over and find out the wall's nearly finished. He went and saw the wall needed to be built. Then he said, let us rise up and build. Number 11, he presented a plan. Good leaders have plans. He told the people, we're going to rise up and build. It's what we're going to do. And I know he was organizing his plan. Chapter 3 is going to tell me that. So we'll just hang on. We'll get to organization, but we're going to get to that in chapter 3. All right, number 12. He informed his followers. Chapter 2, beginning of verse 17. He went and told them, you see the distress we're in, let us rise up and build. Some leaders make decisions and then never inform their followers and then wonder why don't they know what's going on? Because you didn't tell them why. He went and told them, here was the circumstance, here's the problem, and here's the answer. Number 13, this is where we're going to stop. He was a positive thinker. Chapter 2, verse 20. That he answered and said, the God of heaven will prosper us. Y'all think we can't build? You think we can't do it? God of heaven will prosper us, and you're not going to help us. You just keep your hands off. Now, we're not through with that list. I've got 28 qualities I've listed from the book, and you may have more, so we may have 40 by the time we get through. You look for qualities of leadership, and as we go through the rest of the book, and we will finish that list later. Now, your turn. Practical lessons, generally, not just on leadership, things you've learned from these 2 chapters, Nehemiah 1 and 2. What did you learn? I'm sorry? Prayer is important.
Nehemiah, whenever he came up to pray before the king, most people would lie about it, but he knew to tell the truth no matter what the outcome.
Good point.
You took a risk to speak up to the king. You didn't just bring up your wants or needs to that king. There's a reason why he says he's afraid. He
Yeah.
could die
Yeah.
just by
Yeah.
annoying the king.
Yeah, you're here to serve me, and I'm not interested in your problems. You're dead. That could have happened.
It was clear and succinct.
Very clear. Always. Very good. Say again. All right, this. His attitude of reverence and praise, and then his attitude about himself. You clearing your throat to make a comment? Go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
I think we should say that genuine care doesn't just go away, because the time frame from chapter 1 and the instructions to afterwards the 4 months, when he comes before the king 4 months later, he's still very concerned. And so much so that the king can see it. His genuine care for the people that they love did not go away. It didn't matter how much time had passed.
Very good. Let's end with one more, and then we'll be done and start with chapter 3 and 4 next time. Chapter 2:17, I learned this. There is hope in the middle of a mess. Nehemiah sees a mess, and it's nothing but a mess. One of the biggest messes he's ever seen. And yet right in the middle of the mess, he said, let's put it back together. Where many would walk off and say, this is hopeless. I can't even get all the way around to see the whole city. Can't even get my animal through there. But after he can't get through, he says, well, let's rebuild. And so there's hope in the middle of a mess. Chapters 3 and 4 next time.